Thank you, Sasha. Richard, Richard, that's Paul.
No, I'm Richard.
Thank you, Sasha. And welcome everybody to this final event in Right by the Sea. And before we start chatting, I just wanted to say it's been a wonderful, inspiring weekend here once again. I've been involved in most of the festivals since the beginning, and they're always wonderful, and it just gets better and better and better. And I wanted to take this opportunity on behalf of all of those in the audience, all of you, and all of us on the stage, to really congratulate and thank the team of volunteers who make Kilmore Right by the Sea possible. The organising committee, the people who look after the door in the midst of the storm, the car park, all of these folks are volunteers driven by a really strong sense of community, a love of books, a delight in the creative imagination, and Right by the Sea wouldn't be possible without the work of all of these people. I think you can imagine the work that goes into getting something like this off the ground. Imagine it and then double it, because it's just an enormous amount of work. And this festival keeps getting better, but retains its human scale, if I can use it like that. So it's always a delight to be here, and I really think I'd like to ask you to give a round of applause to the committee. And they never stop smiling, even when it's pouring rain and howling wind, so it's fantastic. So anyway, welcome everybody. And Paul, you're delighted to meet you, and you're very welcome to Kilmore. And Sasha mentioned prizes. I don't want to go on and on about prizes, but this time last year you won the Booker Prize, roughly around now. I mean, what has that year been like?
My gosh, what a year. I mean, the things that it gives you, like they told me when I was going to come to Kilmore that it was this idyllic kind of place. And I said, well, I'm a very dark writer, so you're going to have to change up the weather for me. Do something a bit more dramatic to suit my fiction. And they made it happen. So that's part of the power of the Booker. No, it's been an extraordinary year. There's an adjustment required for such a prize that I'm not sure you can ever truly adjust to, because the scale of it it's a global prize now, you know. And I remember the morning after winning, the head of the publicity for the Booker said to me, he said, "There's 3,000 pieces of media around the world this morning with your name in it." And you can't process that, but it's been really beautiful. And I've met thousands and thousands of readers, and there's been some weird moments along the way. I remember being in Sydney, and I had just arrived, and I had to do an interview and a photo shoot with the Sydney Morning Herald. And so I'd been in Melbourne the night before, and I'd washed my hair and realised that my frizzies, which I need to, just to tame the mane, I didn't have my frizzies. And okay, I better go get some. And I was leaving the hotel, and this lady stops me, and she says, "Oh, you're Paul." She says, "I'm here to interview you in half an hour." And I said, "Okay, I need to get some frizzies." And she said, I know some pharmacies near here. So she takes, I said, but you can't write about this, okay? So we go off to the pharmacy and so on and so forth. And then the next day, I get a text message from Donald Ryan. And he just says, "What the fuck is going on down there?" And there was a screen grab of a headline in the Sydney Morning Herald that says, "The day I went shopping for hair products with the Booker Prize winner." So, it's an adjustment. And the thing is, I'm a solitary individual. And so you become public facing in a way that's actually, it's not something that you had actually sort of conceived. Like, you always imagine winning the big prizes. Every writer dreams of it. You think, gosh, to win something like the Booker or the Nobel, like you don't think it's going to happen. But occasionally you find yourself daydreaming, and but what you don't foresee or envision is actually what's on the other side of it, which is that you stop being a writer. I'm not a writer anymore. I'm the CEO of Paul Lynch. And I give talks now about this guy who writes books, but I'm not that guy who writes the books. That guy he's out at sea in the storm, completely lost. And so, I'll come back to him. I'll find him again in a year or two. And I've met a bunch of Booker winners on the road, and they all have that 1,000-yard stare. and like they say, it takes more than a year. Because when you win, they tell you won't ride for a year. It's actually longer.
Yeah,
it's longer.
I just have this image of, meeting other Booker Prize winners on the road, it's like the Rolling Stones.
Oh, we find each other.
Meeting the Beatles, passing.
You just find each other.
Does that terrify you? The idea that writer part of you is lost at sea? Is that? It's a interesting metaphor.
I think the way to think about it is that any writer that you can name who's sort of ascended, so to speak, to this level, they've all gone through it. And they've come out the other side of it. So through the fire into the light. That's the way you have to think about it. Yeah. It's just I'm figuring out what that actually means to do that. And so, let's talk in 2 or 3 years' time and see. The key thing though is that you become a writer fundamentally because you need to exercise your own authenticity. That small, still voice inside you is the voice that you need to live by. Everything else is just distraction and show. That once you learn to truly tune in to that voice, which is essentially your higher self, when you learn to live by that, it becomes spiritual. Like writing is spiritual inquiry. You're setting out to ask questions about the universe in a certain kind of way. So there's an aspect to it that is genuinely spiritual, and that self, when you discover it, is of such importance that you need it every day. And so when you move into this sphere, I do feel like I've lost something, but I also understand this is the nature of the game.
It's interesting. I was thinking about, because we've had lots of Booker Prize nominees and some winners at this festival. I think Irish people, certainly this audience, is so bloody proud of you. People are genuinely delighted. And I don't mean that in a sort of throwaway. I'm being genuine in that. I think we were talking earlier about how many. There's more writers in Ireland than there are
readers.
Than readers, yeah. but it's sort of that. I think in some countries are kind of a bit ashamed of it. People being
the Irish
writers.
own their authors.
Yeah,
it's an extraordinary thing.
I think so. Yeah,
and I think they take huge pride in them.
And take pride in the fact that, Claire Keegan, who's also a friend of the festival here, was nominated, and we look at Sally Rooney's success and the fact that Paul Murray and yourself were on the same shortlist, and people are bloody proud of that and delighted for you.
I'll tell you a story about that, because this was the moment when I realized how truly something had happened in my life, that I'd entered into the culture, in an extraordinary way. I just come back it was a week after winning the Booker Prize, and so I had done a week in the UK that was just, it's like a tsunami wave comes for you, and they hand you a surfboard and say paddle, and you get up in the damn thing. But I got back to Dublin, and it was, I think it was like the 2nd of December or something like that. It was just absolutely mucky black night. And I had to collect my 2 kids from after school, and so they're in the same school that they're always in. And so I went in, and I thought, this is marvelous. Back to reality, just a beautiful, normal, crappy evening in Dublin. And I went in, and I just said to my kids, just grab your coats and your bags. And this 8-year-old is looking at me, and he puts his hand on his chest, and he just starts singing Ireland's Call. And I thought, he's not singing that at me. And then next thing, there was like 10 of them, like from Dead Poets Society, standing there singing Ireland's Call. And I thought, this is the previous few days have been so surreal that I couldn't process it.
Yeah.
And so I took the kids out of the room, and I said to my daughter Emily, I said, they singing that song for me? And she said, no, I don't think so. Like, they sometimes sing that song. I was like, okay, that's fine. So I got in the car, drove home, and then an hour later I got a text message from my friend Dan, who used to be a publishing editor, and he's a kid, 2 kids in the same school. And he said, I'm hearing a tall story that the kids stood up and sang Ireland's Call for You. And I said, it happened. But here's the thing, is that you've just written a book. It's all you've done. You've just written a story. You've made something up. And yet something has happened where something has been transmitted through the culture, where an 8-year-old child feels proud of you enough to stand up and sing. And so we live in a country where the arts is central to the culture. And that is so important, because a country that reads is a country that's self-aware. And we live in a time where we can see the effects of not reading and distraction and this sort of fragmentation of consciousness that's happening in our own time through technology. And there's something really important in that. There's something of value that we have in our culture. And so, John McGahern once said, a writer has no duty to their nation. They just have duty to their sentences. And I would have always said I agree with that. That's my fundamental view on things. But having come through this, I have to say I'm very proud now to be an Irish person, to be an Irish writer. It is when you see how it actually how it touches people. It's people come up to me on the street all the time.
Yeah.
And they do so joyfully because they want to talk about the book.
Yeah. I think people are delighted for you and delighted with the success. I think it's it's marvelous. And I think Joyce was wrong. We're not the sow that eats its furrow, whatever he said.
Joyce, that was a different time.
Yeah.
Where the consciousness of Ireland is a completely different consciousness than it was at that time.
Yeah. I was going to pick up on something you said there earlier then, just to take it on a stage. It all starts, you said it starts with that voice within, almost looking for a way out. In your career, in your writing career, though, I think you were a journalist. It began as journalism. And what was that? How did that move from being a journalist to being a fiction writer come about? I guess there are similarities. You're a journalist and a novelist are both writing stuff and telling stories, I would guess. Was that urge to tell a story?
I was never a frontline journalist. Yeah. I was a back desk individual, which I weren't an individual, actually part of a team. I started out as a sub-editor, so I started out editing other writers. That was the first job that I did, and I was just instinctively drawn to editing. I thought that I just wanted to work with language. I wasn't actually allowing myself consciously the idea that I could be a writer. It just wasn't there. I had dabbled with poetry when I was younger, as a teenager, and I've been in bands and written lyrics and all that kind of stuff, but I'd never written fiction. I've never attended a fiction class in my life. It's not something that I was thinking about doing. But I wanted to work with words, with language. And the best place to do this is in a newspaper. And so I ended up working for the Sunday Tribune. And I was very young I was 19 when I started freelancing. They gave me 1 shift a week. And then it went to 2 shifts. And then I became full-time. And it was an extraordinary period because you're working with the absolute, the best journalists in the country were in there at the time. And but I was working, just editing all day long. And then, I started getting promoted. And so I was running sections, and I had actually the same job as John Banville for a long time. He was the deputy chief sub-editor of the press, and I was the deputy chief sub-editor of the Sunday Tribune. And so a lot of writers come from subs desks. There's something about that where you're just dealing with this torrent of language all day long, and you're shaping it, and you're learning how words work, how sentences work, what tone is. You're learning about compression and clarity, and all of these things, voice. And so I started writing reviews. I was not writing anything, actually. And the funny thing is I actually had to go to therapy to actually give myself permission to write fiction, just to write anything, because I had the big no voice, this big no voice, and the no voice is really dangerous. And where it comes from is, it's where you come from, you know, but I just had this big no voice. And part of it was I just took everything so seriously. I had such high standards that I didn't want to be bad at anything. I didn't want to be a bad writer in any shape or form. So I just wouldn't do it. And I went to therapy, and I had this amazing Jungian analyst, and she just put me straight after about 6 months. And suddenly, one day, just after that, the book editor of the Sunday Tribune, Julie Lord, came up to me and she said, "You need to write a book review for me." And I looked at her and I said, "Okay." And she said, "You're going to review this for me next week, 600 words." And I thought, okay, the universe is testing me here. I'm going to do this. And I wrote the review, and I loved writing it. And she came back next week and said, "That was a really great review. You're going to do another one for me." And this happened. Yeah. And then the magazine desk came over to me soon after, and the film writer Kieran Carty was on holidays, and Kieran would always. The film gig, everyone wanted to be the film critic of the Sunday Tribune. Yeah. And so Kieran would be very defensive about not letting anyone do it. This is just how it always was. So he'd always review well in advance so that nobody could do it. But there was one film that he didn't do, and the magazine editor came over to me and she said, "Will you go review Shaun of the Dead for me?" So I said, "Sure," because I was also a very serious cinema fan. I was a cinephile. I used to take a week off every week just for the Dublin Film Festival, and I would go and watch 3 films a day. And so I reviewed the film, and and then the next week, Kieran came up to me and he said, "That was a really great review. I'm going on holidays, and I want you to cover it for me." And that was a really big deal. And so I did. And so then I shadowed him for a few years. And then when he stepped down, I was made chief critic. And I did that for it was 4 to 5 years. I reviewed over 1,000 films. And it was a serious, exhausting gig. And it was amazing because I was actually writing 2,000 words a week. And as I started to notice that I was taking it very seriously. The writing was literary. I considered that I was like writing essays for like the New Yorker or something. I was trying to do something to a really high standard. And that's when I started to realize that it was just in me. And so I was 30 when the shift happened. I was on holidays in Lipari in the island of Sicily. And I had this epiphany, a classic epiphany. I was in a taxi going up the hill, this winding hill, and the sea was behind me, and it just hit me like a thunderbolt. It was like a voice, and it just said, "You're a novelist. You're meant to be writing fiction. Your life is a lie. What you're doing now is a lie. You need to change now. And if you don't, you will become a bitter old man. You will And the extraordinary thing about this, and how did I know? Because I hadn't written any fiction. How did I know I was meant to be doing this? But I knew. And so it's intuition is such an important part of artistic life, of listening to that voice. You have to learn to listen to it and live in accordance with it. And the swerve is also really important too. When God was throwing Satan out of heaven and Satan fell through the void, what would have happened? What would have happened if he'd swerved? Right? Instead of going into hell, he would have, who knows where he would have landed. Something different would have happened. And so the swerve is a really important idea. We should all be able to swerve. So I live by that idea.
And I mean, now that you are a novelist and you've written very successful novels, a number of them, starting with that one, the first one,
Red Sky Morning,
and
The Black
Prophet
Snow,
Song.
and then, yeah.
Looking back, I mean, do you understand any more clearly why you took that swerve as you went up that hill and thought, you know what, I meant to write novels. I don't know why, but I'm going to do it. Now you're looking back 5 novels on or 6 novels on and thinking,
I mean, there's no real knowing these things. As I've learned, like, the artistic life is really just living alongside what I call the door into the dark, which is your subconscious, or maybe it's the superconscious, because, like, as far as I'm concerned, the intuitive life is what comes through intuition is often much smarter than you are egoically through the day. Who you think you are during the day, thinking your way through the day. It's not very much to talk about. We're not one thing. If you think you're one, your identity is a single thing. quite deluded. It's one of the extraordinary things about consciousness is that it's deluded us into thinking that we're just this one single thing. And so there are many aspects of mind that you cannot see in operation. And so what comes through intuition comes through the blind. It comes up. You can't see it, but if you learn to really listen to it, it's extraordinarily powerful. And so, like, that's the gift for me. It's a gift. I can rationalize it to some degree. I'm a very serious meditator, and I've been meditating for a very long time. And so I've learned to watch my mind, and I can see it perhaps in a way that's more difficult if you don't meditate. So, but I've learned to respect the fact that it's something you cannot call in advance. You can't see it. You can't know it. You just learn to know it when it comes. And so every book like that has been an intuitive act. And, Ingmar Bergman, the great Swedish film director, once said that regarding art, the creation of art, intuition is the spear you throw into the dark, and intellect is the army you send in afterwards. And so there's intellect. There has to be intellect to write a work, like Prophet Song or any book. But the intuitive thing is what gets you there. And when I was writing this book, when I started writing this book, I had been blocked for, I'd been working on the wrong book for 6 months, and I stopped writing one day, and I knew that I was done with this failing novel. It wasn't working like a novel should, and I completely trusted that there was something else waiting. I just had this sense something was waiting, and I came back the following Monday, sat down, and I wrote the opening page of Prophet Song without any forethought, without any idea of what I was setting out on, without any knowledge at all. But this is the extraordinary thing. When I finished the book and I look back on that first page, the meaning of the book is all encoded symbolically in the opening sentences. It's all there. So some part of me did know what was going on, but you can't see it.
Yeah.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah. And I suppose the reader, I wouldn't say the reader completes it, but there's a whole other dynamic then when it enters into the world, And,
A book is nothing without you're nothing without readers.
Nothing without the reader.
The text is nothing without
Despite
a reader.
it being such an intuitive expression, it's nothing without the reader. I might ask you to read in a second, but I was going to ask you just one more thing, just about Red Sky and Morning, actually, because it's grounded in an historical event, and I was kind of thinking of you as a historical novelist. I know it's kind of very old-fashioned kind of thing, and you kind of think
I hate the term. So meaningless. But anyways.
But I was just interested in I was trying to connect it in with that idea of the writer as reporter and the novelist sort of reporting on the world versus the novel as making a world, And I'm thinking, as you're talking, I'm more inclined to think this is a novelist making a world, kind of out of the stuff of consciousness or subconsciousness, rather than, so I suppose, is Red Sky and Morning, or any of the novels really, but let's take that one, it's not really about a historical event.
Not at
That's
all,
the scaffolding on which the thing is hanging.
Every novel is a form of inquiry.
Yeah.
And the way, the more I think about what fiction is and what it does, and, like Camus said that a work of fiction is a philosophical attitude to the world. And I think he's right about that. At least the really great writers. The philosophical attitude is fundamentally a part of what they're doing. And so, but the more I think about what fiction is and what you're doing, I think about it in the abstract. I think about how, when we think about physicists and mathematicians working in the abstract, writing equations in the abstract of truths that we can't really see in the world, but we know they're true, they're proven true. They write these very complex equations. Well, in the same way, fiction does the same thing in the abstract, but what writers are producing are equations of human truth. And so we know them when they're true. It's why Jane Austen still endures, because she has written perfect equations of human truth. When we read her now, we go, yes, that's what we're like. She's presented something to us. And all the great writers come at their equations in different ways. Every writer has a different style, a different attitude to the world. Every writer is seeking some sort of hidden gleam of knowledge that belongs to them. But they're trying to craft equations. And so when I read fiction now, I'm seeing past all the just whatever. And I'm seeing all the way in. I'm seeing all the way in to that.
Yeah.
And that's what when I'm judging writer, that's what I'm judging. And that's I think that's, you know, that's why we go to fiction. We go to writers to present a true human truth, so that we can understand what we are in a way that you cannot understand from any other form. You can't get it from journalism.
Yeah.
We can't get it from ordinary life. Art has this beautiful ability to seize hold of reality, and you put it on the page, and suddenly it's like a mirror. It's this magic mirror. And you can see what we are always. You can see and sort of demonstrate things. The demonstration is really important, to demonstrate ideas or demonstrate truths. Like Prophet Song to me is a demonstration of truths that are enduring truths about human beings. Like there's no solutions. I'm not trying to change anything with this book. I'm not advocating for social change, or, you know, that's not how I see it. I'm presenting a vision of what I think we are fundamentally.
Well, and just to add something to that, Tessa Hadley and Lucy Caldwell were speaking here the other night, and they made an interesting distinction, again, going back to that idea of the writer as journalist, or the writer or writer's reporter and the writer's maker. And they said that if you're a journalist and there's one grain of untruth in your journalism, well, the whole edifice collapses. Because if you're wrong about that fact, well, then you could be wrong about every fact. Whereas for a fiction writer, you only have to be true about one thing. And the rest sort of falls into the reader trusts.
But all of fiction is mistruth, because it's not true. You're making it up. But it's the truth underneath it.
Yeah, and it's finding that, and it strikes me, it's finding that truth underneath. And in your case, it seems to come from, it's finding that truth within, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of that gives that authenticity and credibility to the voice. You know?
Yeah.
Do you want to read
Let
something?
me read.
Yeah, please do, yeah.
You're going to read from the opening.
Great.
Can you hear the wind? Isn't it marvelous?
It's a great soundtrack, yeah.
I love it. Yeah. The night has come, and she has not heard the knocking, standing at the window looking out onto the garden. How the dark gathers without sound the cherry trees. It gathers the last of the leaves, and the leaves do not resist the dark, but accept the dark and whisper. Tired now, the day almost behind her, all that still has to be done before bed, and the children settled in the living room. This feeling of rest for a moment by the glass, watching the darkening garden, and the wish to be at one with this darkness, to step outside and lie down with it, to lie with the fallen leaves and let the night pass over, to wake then with the dawn and rise renewed with the morning come. But the knocking, she hears it pass into thought, the sharp, insistent rapping, each knock possessed so fully of the knocker she begins to frown. Then Bailey, too, is knocking on the glass door to the kitchen. He calls out to her, "Ma'am," pointing to the hallway without lifting his eyes from the screen. Eilish finds her body moving towards the hall with the baby in her arms. She opens the front door, and two men are standing before the porch glass, almost faceless in the dark. She turns on the porch light, and the men are known in an instant from how they are stood. The night cold air suspiring, it seems, as she slides open the patio door. The suburban quiet, the rain falling almost unspoken onto St. Lawrence Street, upon the black car parked in front of the house. How the men seem to carry the feeling of the night. She watches them from within her own protective feeling. The young man on the left is asking if her husband is home, and there's something in the way he looks at her, the remote yet scrutinizing eyes that make it seem as though he is trying to seize hold of something within her. In a blink, she has sought up and down the street, seeing a lone walker with a dog under an umbrella, the willows nodding to the rain, the strobings of a large TV screen in the Zajic's house across the street. She checks herself then, almost laughing. This universal reflex of guilt when the police call to your door. Ben begins to squirm in her arms, and the older plainclothes man to her right is watching the child. His face seems to soften, and so she addresses herself to him. She knows he too is a father. Such things are always known. That other fellow is much too young, too neat and hard-boned. She begins to speak, aware of a sudden falter in her voice. He'll be home soon, in an hour or so. Would you like me to give him a ring? No, that will not be necessary, Mrs. Stack. When he comes home, could you tell him to call us at his earliest convenience? This is my card. Please, call me Eilish. Is it something I can help you with? No, I'm afraid not, Mrs. Stack. This is a matter for your husband. The older plainclothes man is smiling fully at the child, and she watches for a moment the wrinkles about the mouth. It is a face put out by solemnity, the wrong face for the job. There's nothing to worry about, Mrs. Stack. Why should I be worried, darling? Yes, indeed, Mrs. Stack. We don't want to be taking up any more of your time, and are to be damp enough this evening making calls. It'll be hard work getting ourselves dry by the heater in the car. She slides the patio door closed, holding the card in her hand, watching the two men return to the car, watching the car move up the street. It brakes for the junction, and its tail lights intensify, taking the look of two eyes agleam. She looks once more onto the street, returns to an evening's quiet, the heat from the hall as she steps inside and shuts the front door, and then she stands a moment examining the card and finds she has been holding her breath. This feeling now that something has come into the house. She wants to put the baby down. She wants to stand and think, seeing how it stood with the two men and came into the hallway of its own accord. Something formless yet felt. She can sense it skulking alongside her as she steps through the living room past the children. Molly is holding the remote control over Bailey's head, his hands flapping in the air. He turns towards her with a pleading look. Ma'am, tell her to put my show back on. Eilish closes the kitchen door and places the child in the rocker, begins to clear from the table her laptop and diary, but stops and closes her eyes. This feeling that came into the house has followed. She looks to her phone and picks it up, her hand hesitating. She sends Larry a message, finds herself again by the window watching outside. The darkening garden not to be wished upon now, for something of that darkness has come into the house.
And I think if you've read the rest of the book, it sort of keeps going from there. Yeah.
Implacably.
Yeah. It's not a comedy, just to say. When that came, that first page or those first pages, and you knew, shit, this is right. It came kind of all of a sudden. I mean, is that a voice? Is that a narrative voice and a narrative authority that suddenly goes, yeah. Okay, I know. Doesn't matter what I'm saying. I've got the voice.
Well, it's many things. It's a voice. It's a deep. There's this sort of. Well, it goes back to what the Greeks called the daemon. The Greeks called the daemon. The Greeks believed that we didn't. That the sort of bursts of inspiration didn't come from within you. They came from the gods, and you were channeling it. And that was the daemon, your personal daemon was intervening on your behalf. But like fundamentally, creatively, when you're in peak flow, when you're on the page doing something that you're arriving at your best work, it's daemonic. There's something in the language. There's a charge to the language that's yours. And it's not something you can think your way into. You cannot think your way into the daemon. It's entirely an intuitive act. It's channeling. It's not channeling from without, it's channeling from within. It's your own mind, but you're entering into the language. And so it takes huge, I think there has to be a very deep understanding of language for that to happen. But what happens is the language becomes charged with something. There's an ineffable substance to it. And you know it when you see it. I know it when I read it in other writers, and I knew it. I was like, there it is. And it just had that energy, and it had, Virginia Woolf said that style is rhythm, and so the rhythm is really important. Like this book to me is an incantation. It is an incantatory quality to the writing that I wanted it to have, in a way that it almost, like there's a lot of the Greeks in this book. Greek tragedy is a huge part of my thinking. It's a huge sort of part of the metaphysics in this book. The epics, this idea of presenting something that feels ancient but in a very, very modern form. And so bringing the two of them together like that.
Yeah.
And so like the sentences for me are something that I think very deeply about. A sentence to me is not just a sentence. That when you're writing a book like this, it's like, why are you writing in the way that you're writing? Like, why am I writing in long sentences? Why am I choosing to do this or that? And to me, the sentence is a form of inquiry. I write in the present tense. And writing in the present tense means that I can get up alongside that feeling of the unknown. Because we're all in the unfolding moment. We're always in the now. We don't know what's coming next. This is what the Greeks were amazing at demonstrating, that we're all in the labyrinth. We make these decisions, and we don't know what's going to come next. And what we reap is always the unforeseen. You could never predict the future. And the Greeks call that ate. And like, to me, all of my novels, this is what they do, but the last three in particular are really zoning in on this sort of, the problem of knowledge, the problem of knowing the world, the problem of reading the world. So we move through darkness, all of us, with just matchlight, this small flame trying to read the world. And so this is what my sentences are designed to do. They're designed to get you into that moment, that feeling of the anxiety of the moment, the feeling of dread almost. And those effects then play out at a larger level through the novel.
Yeah. I was struck by your novels are set in Ireland, or they deal with Irish people and in circumstances in our history and so on. But it strikes me even more powerfully as you talk that your voice is, the voice of the novels is not necessarily an Irish voice. It takes account of Irish voices, and it has some of the rhythms of Irish speech and their Irish sentences in some respects. But that the energy is a European energy, and it seemed to me to be as much dependent on European traditions, and the Greek tragedies is a great something I'm going to think about when I think about Prophet Song again, or even biblical narrative.
Yeah.
As much as it is about Irish narrative.
Yeah, I mean, like, what is the Irish tradition anyway? It's like, it's manifold. There's a certain tradition that you could say maybe McGahern represents, and there's a bunch of writers who follow McGahern. But like, Joyce is a tradition, Beckett's a tradition. Choose any major Irish writer. They're all radically different from each other. I do my thing, and I don't write into a tradition at all. I have no interest. I have no interest in that, and I draw on. Like, obviously, Irish writing is in the water. You cannot but be influenced by, you don't even need to read Joyce to know what Joyce is, or to have a sense of Joyce, or the music. It's in us. We carry it. It's just like writers, Beckett and Joyce in particular, and Yeats, were such cultural behemoths that the energy that they transmitted into the language has been transmitted into the culture ever since. So you don't need to read these writers. But for me, I've drawn very deeply from the Greeks, from a lot of philosophers. I've a lot of European writing. Saramago is a writer I love very much. A lot of South American writers. The Argentinians in particular are really metaphysical writers. They have this metaphysical tradition of like novels that are just like kind of taking from Dostoevsky this idea of inquiry of what the fuck are we in this world, and really going after it. The Americans, writers like Faulkner and O'Connor and McCarthy and Melville, these writers are a huge part of my DNA too.
They were the two names that jumped to mind. Well, the two books that came to my mind in reading Prophet Song were Moby Dick and Blood Meridian.
Yeah.
And I think your sentences certainly have a resemblance at times to Cormac McCarthy's sentences. But I think plugging into that mythology, that subconscious mythology, that, you know, Moby Dick is not about a man chasing a whale.
No, you start reading Moby Dick and you think, this is a book about whale
Whaling,
hunting.
yeah.
And then you get halfway through Moby Dick and you're like, this book's about obsession.
Yeah.
And then you get to the end of Moby Dick and you're like, oh, this book's about the absolute.
Yeah.
You know.
But I think rhythmically, the prose, your prose, I think owes so much to those, not owes so much, but one can see those voices coming out as well.
Poetry is very important to me,
Yeah.
and I read a lot of poetry, and I grew up reading a lot of poetry, and I think that, style should try and meet the world in its in its unfolding, how the world is. The world is infinitely strange. It's infinitely rich. It's infinitely complex. And this idea of writing this kind of bare bones sentence where everything sounds the same all the way through and language is pared back, that's just a style. It's just a tradition. And I have zero interest in that because I don't think that's how the world is. I think that you have an obligation as an artist to meet the world. And so, I try to meet it in the way that I try to understand it. And so I try to create a form that can do that. But also, beauty is a huge part of this. Life is very beautiful when you truly observe it. Like it's so even my books, when they're like, they get pretty dark,
Yeah, they do.
My gosh,
Yeah.
like they'll walk the reader up to the abyss and ask them to stare in.
Yeah.
But always, there's the poet holding the reader's hand. And I think I thought about this actively when I was writing Prophet Song, about how when Dante went into the underworld, Virgil, the poet, accompanied him. And so that the role of the poet is something very important about the role of beauty to sort of seduce the reader into these spaces where they don't want to go, but also at the same time to sort of guide them through it, to remind them through the incantation that it is poetry, that it's a story, but it's also truth.
Yes.
So that when the reader is being summoned to stare into the abyss, into that void, they don't fall in because the poet's there holding their hand.
Yeah, I think that's very true. It's a high wire act, though, isn't it? I mean,
Don't write novels. I don't recommend it.
Yeah, no, but it just struck me. I mean, just going back to the early part of the conversation, I mean, that the discipline that you learned as an editor, writing film reviews, and I don't want 650 words, I want 600 words, please. And the ability to, because I think it's the biggest obstacle in some ways to good writing, is being precious about the stuff and thinking what I produce is a masterpiece in first draft. And I think it's finding, for me, there's a real high wire act in getting those sentences right and them becoming precious and sort of, and I think there's a muscularity and a substance about what you're writing, not just because the subject is that dark stuff, but because the sentences are bloody good sentences.
Well, I don't write in a lot of writers, they write and they kind of, it's called the vomit draft, or they just spew it out and then they try to fix it later. I think that's a crazy method.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it works because what it does is it unlocks your intuitive higher mind. So that's really important. If that's how you can unlock it, then that's the way to do it. But I edit as I write because I'm looking for that equation aspect, that idea of the language, and I'm looking for a degree of precision in the ideas. I'm looking for what is called in philosophy the principle of sufficient reason, that every word is in the right place for the right reason. And then if you start moving things around, it collapses. The meaning changes. And so the meaning is really, really important, and the sense of the rhythm. And so, like, my first drafts aren't perfect, but they're very close to what the end book is. But those first drafts are constantly rewriting. The idea of you just put down one sentence after another and it's exactly how it should be is nonsense. All writing is rewriting, fundamentally. And so when I'm writing, I just don't write race up to the end because I want what's happened to be inevitable. It's locked in. It could not be otherwise.
Yeah.
In the same way that if you stand now in your own life and you look back, everything that's taken you to here now could not be otherwise. And it's an important truth to realize in your own life. Everything that has been has had to be that way. And so fiction, I think, should have the same truths, the same laws. And so when I was writing this book, I understood that the very ending of the book is a line said by Ellie Stack, which I'm not going to say, but what she says is something that is counterintuitive, but she believes it to be true. And for her to believe this to be true, I had to prove it true. And so it goes back to the idea of like everything suddenly just locking into this series of truths, like this, because of this, because of this, because of this. And so that when you learn to listen at that level to what you're doing, you have a much greater understanding of, well, why am I doing this fiddly thing over here? I don't need that. It's about getting the line as clean as possible.
And convincing the reader, I would guess, that last line is true. That last line is, if I can put it like this, is inevitable. From the first page, or from the first pages. And isn't that the thing in Greek tragedy, that you just know how this thing is going to end, but you sort of have to bear with it.
Yeah, I think of the last lines of my books like the proofs, the QEDs, the things that I've had to prove true. And so, in my head, I know the last lines of the last 3 books in particular, and they're very particular. There's so they've proven something.
I think my other thought I have just on style, I guess, another reason why the sentences that you write are so fantastic and at the same time on a knife edge is it's very hard to write in a grand style, and I would say your style is a grand style at times at least, and pull it off when you're not in Death Valley or like in Moby Dick, out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You're writing about a corner of a field or a suburban street, and yet you seem to be able to deploy this grand prose to write about this mundane world that we're all familiar with. Whereas somebody like McCarthy, he's got to be out in the middle of the Death Valley.
It's to do with scalability. It's to do with what you're actually writing about. So like if there is a tradition that in some way I belong to, like many of the writers we're talking about, I consider them to be cosmic realists. And I wrote an essay about this last year for the Booker Prize. People, they asked us all to write these essays, and I wrote an essay about this. And I see a tradition that's actually not being articulated very well. And there's a cohort of writers that very specifically have built their careers on crafting images that represent the full scale of the human experience to us, as though watching us from a cosmic eye. And these writers often are misunderstood for what they're doing. They're not writing social novels. They're not writing, they do articulate the furniture in the room and the ordinary lives, but at the same time there's this enormous scale. So I'm talking about writers that Melville, Dostoevsky, Conrad, a lot of male writers in particular, but Flannery O'Connor was one of these writers, and she wrote about this to a certain extent in one of her essays. Virginia Woolf touches on this. It's about being able to hold and craft images that can give us the full sense of the enormity of experience, so that the stories are not just stories about the story. It's actually representing symbolically something far greater. And so what I mean by that is there's a brilliant, brilliant image in Conrad's Typhoon, where the boat swaying in the midst of a typhoon, this shipwrecking storm out on the Indian Ocean in pitch blackness, has to climb down into the hold, right? He goes down through a coal bunker and then into the hold of the ship. And in the hold of the ship are all these Chinese workers who've been working for 10 years, saving all their money into these treasure chests, and these wooden chests. And they're going back home after 10 years. And the sea has pitched the boat so violently that all their treasure chests have smashed together and all their money is mixed up. And in the darkness, they're all tearing at each other and fighting over their money, right? And this image, this one single image of the Chinese workers killing each other in this dark hold on a ship, on a shipwrecking storm, on an abyssal ocean, is an extraordinary image of what the human condition is in this silent cosmos that we're in. And that's what I'm talking about. That's where grand style can
Yeah.
makes sense.
Can lead you, yeah,
That's
yeah.
that's when the power of it can come through.
Yeah, yeah. I might ask you to read another bit if you don't mind, but before I do, I was going to ask you just one more thing, which is...
We didn't agree a second reading.
Oh,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
you don't have to. What I was going to ask you, you talked about film earlier. I mean, you're writing in the present tense. You're talking there about finding an image, I think your work is so filmic. Have you written for film? Have you been interested in writing for film? Or could you comment on that filmic component in Prophet Song or in the other books?
Well, it's like cinema is just a big influence for me.
Yeah.
It's something that I've thought a lot about because I've watched critically, 1,000 films, but I've also spent, a decade or more before that obsessively watching serious cinema and thinking about it. And so I've learned a lot about the world from that. And, I really, there's like people like Bergman who, almost seemed cliched in the idea of what they were doing, which is kind of serious cinema. That's not so popular anymore. It's hard to get these films made for a start now. But there was a project. There was a serious inquiry into the human condition that's just not there in cinema so much anymore. Where like Michael Haneke, the Austrian filmmaker, is a huge influence on me. I love that he makes films that do not swerve from what he wants you to see. And he knows it's going to make you really, really uncomfortable. He knows that he's going to, like, something is going to be really deeply unsettled in you, but he holds the gaze and he makes you see it. And it's that challenge, that ability of like the artist knowing what their sense of truth is and being committed to that. Because a lot of filmmakers will turn away. They'll avert their gaze because they don't want to upset the viewership, and they'll soften it up. They'll stick a happy ending on, and they don't offer consolation. And so I think they're truth tellers, and I love cinema like that. And I just I love filmmakers who shoot in really long takes, and the skill to do that. It's like The Long Sentence too.
Yeah. What struck me is, your grasp, your skill with narrative. You're telling bloody good stories, and they hold and they work as stories.
But I'm a storyteller first.
Yeah.
Like we're here
absolutely,
talking about sentences. It's almost boring in a sense because, I'm fundamentally a storyteller. This is what I learned watching cinema, is that no matter how fragmented or atomized a film can be, there are some French movies, would say, just for hilarious shorthand, but that can be really, really fractured. They're always telling a story. They have to, otherwise it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So narrative is built into everything, and I've thought a lot about story over the years, just about that I'm interested in telling stories because I think that telling a story is the most difficult thing to do right. No matter what way you're coming at it, to actually craft a vessel that goes out to sea and sails perfectly, that's an extremely hard thing to do. Yeah. And so I love the challenge of that. And you put your ideas underneath in the hold. You don't put your ideas on top. You don't tell the reader. It's like you put it underneath. And I chase a lot of big ideas in my writing, but it's underneath the sentences. On top, I'm telling a story, and I just love. I love that idea of that. Like, the closer a story gets to myth, the more freight it carries, the more universal freight it carries. So. Like that's the goal for me, is to craft stories that can have this mythic dimension, that can have this extra weight to it. They're resonating on many different ways.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on something you said there about the abyss, because I'll take a long way to ask the question, right? But if you know the film Schindler's List, just to take a filmic example, there's a scene in that where a group of women end up in Auschwitz, and they go through the process of being selected and being stripped and their heads shaved and tattoos on their arms, and they go through the whole...
They go into the chamber.
And they go into the gas chamber.
They go into the chamber.
And they hear the creaking of the pipes, and next thing water comes out of the pipes, and they celebrate, and they get out and they go to Oskar Schindler's factory, And that's getting up to the edge of the abyss. But Steven Spielberg, being Steven Spielberg, doesn't look in quite. And I remember reading an essay by Martin Amis about J.G. Ballard's novel Crash. And I don't know if any of you know, do you know J.G. Ballard's novel Crash? But if anybody read J.G. Ballard's novel Crash, it's a pretty dark novel. And he talks about nerve, holding your nerve. And I think in Prophet Song, there is one of the most distressing scenes I've read in fiction.
Yeah, which we can't discuss.
Which we won't discuss
detail,
necessarily for people who haven't read it, but it is extraordinary, extraordinary, Paul. I thought it was unbelievable, and it was a real example for me of somebody holding imaginatively, aesthetically, and morally his nerve.
Yeah.
Without saying what it is.
Yeah, I mean, that's chapter 8, and I couldn't write chapter 8 for a bunch of months, and it was during the lockdown, and everyone was going stir crazy. I wasn't going stir crazy because level 4, do you remember the levels? Level 1 to 5. Well, level 4 is my normal reality, so level 4 wasn't too much of a problem for me, but I couldn't write this chapter because I knew that I had to do something that was sort of next level, so to speak. I had to do something that I was asking the reader to engage in that was deeply distressing. It's distressing for me to do it. I didn't know how to write it. I didn't know how to confront it. I was blocked for a number of months. I remember going on many long walks, just thinking, how am I going to do this? And what's interesting, it goes back to this idea of, what's back here is I had a dream, and I woke up from the dream and grabbed my notebook and wrote for half an hour. The dream, I ended up writing a big, long essay for the Sting and Fly about this, about what this dream, how it revealed to me, all in one dream, symbolically, it's solving 3 problems in my life, all in the one dream. That when you spend time with it, it was all there. It was incredible, and it showed me how to write that chapter. It showed me how to write an essay that I was commissioned to write, and it also showed me how to do something else. And it was like you get one of these dreams every 5 years, but you have to know when they come, and you have to know how to pay attention to them.
Yeah.
And because often you just think dreams are nonsense, and a lot of them are just phooey cartoons, they're just REM dreams. But some dreams, the ones that wake you up and that sit with you all day long, that's your symbolic imagination at you. And there is a part of our mind that works this way. Like human beings are only speaking for 100,000 years, but we're around for much, much longer. And so how do we understand the world? There are aspects of mind that we don't understand. And so I understood how to write this chapter from that dream, and I broke curfew, I broke lockdown. I remember getting in the car and thinking about Ailey Stack. I was thinking, gosh, I'm now living inside my own novel. Like coming up with excuses in case I'm stopped by the guards. But I drove to a house in Roscommon, and I wrote that chapter in 5 days. And I'm a very slow writer, but it was all building up. And it knew how it needed to be written. And I've had people I think one of the things that has been really amazing to get, because I've signed, I've met thousands of people now, I've just an awful lot of book queues over the last year, and people telling me just how much the book has changed them. That it's actually telling me that it's changed the way they think about the world. It's changed the way they watch the news. It's changed, you're saying that the book got inside them in a way that they're never going to forget. That, because I think that fiction should do this. It should push you. It should come at you and get underneath and grab you. Because when we read when we're teenagers, we're such a blank canvas that we're really wide open to the great books, and they can grab us in all sorts of ways and change us. And then we kind of grow indifferent, and we get bored, and so on and so forth. And I think that, for me, I'm pushing to try and make the world strange again, to make it interesting, but also to make it truthful in a way that's going to really engage the reader. And I've had people, God help them, tell me that, I've had a number of people tell me that they're on long-haul flights and they're just completely broken on the plane, just sobbing, and they couldn't stop, and people are asking, what's wrong with you? And they're just I've just read this book, and it's very powerful to hear that this lonely impulse to sit down and write some fiction in a room can produce this kind of effect.
Yeah, and I suppose honoring your own truth and being able to discern your own truth as it emerges in dreams or from the demon or wherever.
The daemon.
The daemon.
Daemon, yeah.
I guess, because I think that's, I don't know, you know the scene I'm talking about, I'm sure anybody's read the book. It has an inevitability about it, but you're reading it, you know, almost because you don't want to turn that page or read that next sentence because you know how it's going to end.
It belongs to the complexity of the world that you can't see hiding behind the news images that you watch on the news every night. You know, we sit at home and you're just watching the spectacle. And you grow up with the spectacle. You grow up eating your dinner and the spectacle is on. And you're watching images of you know, destruction and dispossession and carnage. And you're watching, you know, the biblical actually happen in your own time on the screens. Like people crossing continents to find a place of greater safety. And just eating our dinners. And it, you know, we feel it, but we don't. And we watch people on the boats and we feel it, but we don't. We don't enter into the complexity of it. And one of the reasons we don't enter into it is because we've become completely inured to it. Because how can you take on all of this suffering? It's too much. But yet, maybe we have more of an obligation to do so. And so, but it's also about how much can we even contain, you know, in our own lives. Like all of us are carrying so much. How can you truly enter into the complexity and truly understand why people make these kind of decisions? That was a big part of this book, is to enter into the complexity of what happens in an unraveling. And so that's what I'm chasing.
And was Prophet Song written out of I get from you a feeling of obligation to that inner voice, yes. But did you sort of feel, because one of the blurbs on the back is a crucial book for our times. But does one set out to say, I'm going to sit down here now and write a crucial book for our times? Because I feel an obligation to our times,
No. That's not how it works. Like, a lot of people said this is a zeitgeist novel, and I just laughed. The idea of, like, capturing a zeitgeist, like, I'm just going to capture it in a bottle here, and, you know, that's not how it works. I was always a writer writing outside of, you know, the contemporary anyway, in the sense of, like, what mainstream fiction is doing. You know, I never felt that I belonged to that. I felt like I was chasing something on a far corner of the fringes all along. And so I never thought that I was capturing the zeitgeist, seizing hold of the moment. That's just part of just maybe the magic of writing. What comes out cannot be ascertained in advance.
Yeah, because I think I thought of Prophet Song alongside The Plot Against America by Philip Roth, which is similarly a sort of a speculative book about kind of what might happen if in Roth's case it was if a right-wing demagogue took over the United States. I mean, I don't think it could ever happen that somebody like that could become president. But in Roth's imagination, it's about Charles Lindbergh becoming president of America and a fascist state being ushered in. And I thought of Prophet Song alongside that novel, but actually, and talking to you just confirmed it. It's a very, very different dynamic kind of book.
It's not a speculative
novel. It's not a speculative book at all.
It's not a dystopian novel.
No.
Like I remember there was a couple. I don't read my reviews, but there was one or two really seemed to be very daft. They were like saying it's a failing dystopian novel. It's like, it's not a dystopian novel. Like anything that's speculative ceases to be speculative if it's reflecting what's actually happening in the world now. You know, this book is, you start reading and you think, oh, maybe I'm in some sort of futuristic Ireland or counterfactual Ireland. But very quickly, if you're paying attention, you realize the book is a Trojan horse. That what it's revealing to you is not just a cautionary tale, if you want to read it that way, of maybe this would happen to a Western country. It's actually what is happening. It's the existential experience of what's happened to millions of people in our own time. What's been happening always. And there's this moment at the end of the book when Ailish Stack is looking out. She's come through the unraveling and she's lost almost everything. And she understands that, you know, the end of the world, as we've been told it, this idea of biblical cataclysm, that it's a myth. It's all it is a myth. It's just a story you've grown up with. That the end of the world is actually always occurring again and again and again and again. And it's always local. The end of the world is always a local event. It comes to your city, your town, it knocks on your door. It's the end of the world for your family, your community, your city, your people. And meanwhile, everyone else just watches it on the news. It passes into history, into folklore, and so into myth. And so, like, this is what this book is. This is what this book isn't. I don't think of it as a political novel. It's not grievance. It's grief. It's a wail of grief. It's what we are always. It's what has been happening always, and what will also always continue to happen. It's what's happening right now. And you know, like there is, whether you like to admit it or not, there is some kind of wretchedness built into the human condition, that we do this to each other again and again and again, and it's never going to change. That's how I see it from my cynical, novelistic pulpit.
But you don't write cynical books. I didn't think any of your books were cynical. I thought at the heart of them was a truth. Whether that's a dark truth or not, it's still a truth, and the truth is something to hold on to, right?
No, they're not cynical
they're
at
not
all,
cynical.
actually. No, they're actually very, like, if you think of a book like Grace or Beyond the Sea, they're books of spiritual inquiry into how do we create meaning in our lives. And they arrive at places that I think are very moving. You know, like, because we have to live meaningfully. And that's something that's a huge part of the project that I write. How do we arrive at dignity? How do we have a sense of dignity in this world, in this silent world that's around us, that does not give a damn about us?
We started talking about the craziness of the post-Booker Paul Lynch and the other Paul out in the sea, a bit lost. When all of the craziness subsides, if ever? What's your next? Have you any next projects?
Silence. My next project is silence. Solitude. A room with the internet unplugged, the phone turned off for long periods of time. I mean that. Like, Like, I've had enough of this guy, this individual.
Persona,
I'm sick of him. I want to get back to who I am, which is just a writer. You know.
Well, we await. I just said at the start, come and talk to me in 2 or 3 years' time, and we'll see. And maybe on behalf of Right by the Sea, we'll invite you back in 2 or 3 years' time and talk more. I've really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Rick.
Learned a lot about your own work and about writing. And thank you so much for a really lovely hour.
Thank you.